I was 16 when my dad crushed my dreams at our kitchen table on a cold February evening. I had been clutching my college acceptance letter for 20 minutes, waiting for the right moment to share the news. My hands were sweating as I slid the envelope across the scratched wooden surface toward where he sat reading the newspaper. Dad barely glanced at it before pushing it back toward me. "Don't fool yourself, kid. You'll never afford college. You'll end up just like me." His words hit harder than any punch he could have thrown. Mom looked down at her plate of meatloaf, saying nothing. "If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from." The acceptance letter from State University suddenly felt worthless in my trembling fingers. The silence that followed felt like it would swallow me whole. I folded the letter carefully and walked to my room, my face burning with shame and anger. That night, something died inside me, but something else was born. A fire that would burn for years to come. I lay awake that entire night, staring at the water stain on my ceiling and replaying his words over and over. "You'll never afford college. You'll end up just like me." The way he had said it, with such certainty, made my chest tight with rage. My fists clenched under the thin blankets as I made a promise to myself. I whispered it into the darkness like a prayer, "I'll prove him wrong. One day, he'll need me more than I'll ever need him." The acceptance letter sat on my nightstand, and every time I looked at it in the dim light, I felt that fire grow stronger. I didn't know how I would do it, but I would find a way to college. I would find a way to success. I would find a way to make him eat those words someday. The house was quiet except for the sound of my dad snoring down the hall. Soon, I promised myself, I wouldn't have to listen to that sound anymore. The verbal abuse didn't stop there. Over the next few months, Dad found new ways to tear me down. When I brought home good grades, he said, "Grades don't pay bills, boy. Real world doesn't care about your report card." When I talked about my future plans, he laughed that bitter laugh I had grown to hate. "You think you're special? You're not. You're just like every other kid who thinks the world owes them something." He compared me to other kids whose parents had money, pointing out everything I lacked. Each comment was like a nail being hammered into my confidence, but instead of staying buried, those nails became something I could use to build with. Every insult made me more determined to prove him wrong. I started to see the pattern behind his cruelty. Dad wasn't just mean for the sake of being mean. He was scared that I might actually succeed where he had failed so spectacularly. Behind his cruel words, I glimpsed something that looked like fear. A mess. Alvarez noticed me staying after class, working on assignments long after other students had left for home. She was my English teacher, a kind woman in her 40s who seemed to actually care about her students' futures. One afternoon in March, she asked me to stay behind after the final bell rang. "Evan, I've been watching you work. You have real talent, and more importantly, you have drive," she said, pulling out a thick folder from her desk drawer. "Have you seriously considered applying for scholarships?" My heart jumped at the word. I explained my situation carefully, my dad's job at the manufacturing plant, our tight budget, his absolute belief that college was impossible for someone like me. Ms. Alvarez smiled sadly. "Evan, there are paths forward that don't require your parents' financial support or approval. You just need to know where to look." She handed me the folder. It was full of scholarship applications, grant information, financial aid forms, and resources I had never heard of. 3 months later, after countless hours of applications and essays, I had secured enough financial aid to cover most of my college expenses. The scholarship money, combined with federal student loans and a work-study program, would actually get me through 4 years. When I told Dad about my acceptance and financial aid package, I expected him to be proud. Instead, his face turned red with anger, and he slammed his beer bottle down on the kitchen counter. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "You think this family isn't good enough for you? Think you're too good for honest work? The argument that followed was the worst we'd ever had, with him calling me ungrateful, arrogant, and foolish. That night, I packed everything I owned into 2 battered suitcases. As I walked toward the front door with my belongings, Dad called after me, "Don't come crawling back when you fail, because you will fail." I didn't turn around. I didn't look back. I just kept walking toward my future. College was harder than anything I had ever imagined, but not in the way I had expected. I was taking 18 credit hours each semester while working 25 hours a week at the campus bookstore. Most nights, I got only 3 or 4 hours of sleep, surviving on coffee and determination. I lived off ramen noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever free food I could find at campus events. While other students went to parties, joined clubs, or hung out in the quad enjoying their college experience, I was either studying in the library or working at the bookstore. There were times when exhaustion made my vision blurry during lectures, times when my stomach growled so loud during quiet exams that people turned to stare. My clothes were second-hand, my textbooks were borrowed or bought used, and my dorm room was the smallest, cheapest option available. But every time I wanted to quit, I heard my dad's voice, "You'll never afford college." That voice pushed me forward when nothing else could. During my sophomore year, the exhaustion finally caught up with me dramatically. I was shelving textbooks during my evening shift at the bookstore when suddenly the floor seemed to tilt sideways. One moment I was reaching for a high shelf, the next I was waking up on the cold linoleum floor with my coworker Jordan kneeling beside me, looking genuinely worried. "Dude, when's the last time you actually ate a real meal?" he asked, helping me sit up slowly. I tried to remember but honestly couldn't recall my last proper meal. Jordan helped me to the employee break room and bought me a sandwich and chips from the vending machine. As I ate, grateful for every bite, he told me about his own struggles paying for school. We became friends that day, bonded by our shared determination to succeed despite the financial odds stacked against us. Jordan became my study partner, my source of encouragement, and the first person since Ms. Alvarez who understood what I was going through. Having someone in my corner made the impossible feel just a little more possible. In my junior year, everything changed when I landed an internship at a tech startup called Innovate Solutions. The company was small but growing fast, and the CEO was Grace Lynn, a brilliant woman in her 30s who had built the company from nothing more than an idea and determination. She reminded me of myself in some ways, hungry for success and willing to outwork everyone else. Grace noticed my work ethic immediately, predominantly because it stood out even among other hardworking interns. While other interns complained about long hours or boring tasks, I stayed late and consistently asked for more projects, more responsibility. Grace started giving me assignments far beyond what a college intern should handle, sitting in on client meetings, contributing ideas to project planning. "You remind me of myself at your age," she told me one day as we worked late on a presentation. Hungry and determined to prove something to the world. Grace became my mentor, teaching me about business strategy, leadership, and what it really took to succeed in the competitive world I was determined to enter. During winter break of my senior year, just as I was starting to feel confident about my future, my phone rang with a number I recognized but hadn't heard from in over 3 years. The caller ID showed my childhood home number, and for a moment I just stared at it ringing. I let it go to voicemail, my hands shaking slightly as I waited. When I finally listened to it an hour later, it was my dad's voice, but he sounded different, rough, uncertain, smaller somehow. "Evan, it's your father. Look, things aren't working out for me here. The plant's cutting jobs left and right, and they're talking about closing our whole department. Maybe we should talk, you know? I mean, maybe we should just talk." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing heavily. "Call me back when you get this." I stared at the phone for a long time after the message ended. Part of me wanted to call back, but I remembered all those nights when I went to bed hungry rather than ask him for help. I deleted the message without listening to the rest. Graduation day arrived with perfect spring weather, sunny and warm with a light breeze that made everyone's caps flutter during the ceremony. I sat in my cap and gown among thousands of other students, and as we waited for the ceremony to begin, I scanned the crowd for familiar faces. Mom was there in the third row, crying and waving enthusiastically when she saw me looking in her direction. She had driven 6 hours to be there, had taken time off from her job at the diner. The empty seat next to her told me everything I needed to know about Dad's priorities and his feelings about my achievement. When they called my name, Evan Watt, summa cum laude, Bachelor of Science in Business Administration, I walked across that stage alone but proud. The diploma felt heavy in my hands, not from the paper and ribbon, but from everything it represented. 4 years of proving my dad wrong about my potential. 4 years of choosing hope and hard work over his low expectations. As I posed for photos with Mom afterward, both of us crying happy tears, I made a silent promise. Dad would never get to claim credit for my success. After graduation, Grace offered me a full-time position as a project manager at Innovate Solutions, and I threw myself into my career with the same intensity one had brought to college. The business world suited me perfectly. It rewarded hard work, strategic thinking, and the ability to solve problems under pressure. Within 2 years, I had been promoted to senior project manager, then director of operations. Within 5 years, I was the chief operations officer of a company that now employed over 200 people. I had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, a salary that would have seemed impossible when I was eating ramen noodles for dinner every night, and the respect of colleagues who valued my judgment. The 16-year-old boy who had been told he would never afford college now owned a downtown condo, drove a luxury car, and had investment accounts that grew larger every month. I had achieved everything my dad said was impossible, and more. But success hadn't made me forget where I came from. If anything, it made those memories burn brighter, a constant reminder of how far I had traveled. On a Tuesday morning in October, 8 years after graduation, I was reviewing job applications for our latest round of hiring when I saw a name that made my blood freeze. There, printed in black ink on official company letterhead, was a name I knew better than my own, Franklin Watt. My hands trembled as I opened the file, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. There was his employment history, 15 years at the manufacturing plant until it closed, followed by a series of increasingly desperate temporary positions. There were his references, his educational background that ended with high school, his desperate attempt to reinvent himself as someone worthy of employment. The application was filled with the kind of optimistic language that poorly masked desperation, phrases like eager to learn and willing to take on any challenge that I recognized as the vocabulary of someone who had run out of better options. After all these years, after all his certainty about my limitations, he needed something from the world I had built. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. I kept coming back to those 2 words, Franklin Watt. I spent the entire afternoon thinking about what to do with his application, unable to concentrate on anything else. Part of me wanted to throw it in the trash and pretend I had never seen it, to let him disappear into the pool of rejected candidates. But a larger part of me was genuinely curious about what would happen if I brought him in for an interview. What would he say when he realized who was sitting across the desk from him? How would he react to seeing what I had accomplished despite his predictions? Not to be cruel, not to humiliate him publicly, but because I genuinely wanted to see what 15 years of reality had taught him. I called our HR department and scheduled Franklin Watt for an interview the following Friday at 2 p.m., giving no indication that I knew the applicant personally. I spent the rest of the week preparing mentally, not interview questions, but preparing myself emotionally to sit across from the man who had tried so hard to destroy my dreams. This wasn't about revenge, I told myself. This was about understanding, about closure, about finally confronting the ghost that had haunted me for so long. Friday afternoon arrived gray and rainy, the kind of weather that makes everything feel heavy and significant. I watched from my office window as people hurried along the sidewalk below, umbrellas blooming like dark flowers, and I wondered if one of those distant figures was my father making his way to what he thought was just another job interview. At exactly 2 p.m., my assistant knocked and announced through the intercom, "Mr. Watt is here for his interview." I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and said as calmly as I could manage, "Send him in." The door opened, and there he was after 8 years of silence. 15 years older than the man who had crushed my dreams at our kitchen table, grayer, smaller somehow, diminished by time and circumstance. He was wearing a suit that had clearly seen better days and carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived several decades of use. His eyes widened when he saw me behind the massive mahogany desk, his mouth falling open slightly as recognition dawned. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I gestured to the leather chair across from my desk and said in my most professional voice, "Mr. Watt, please have a seat." The interview that followed was unlike anything either of us could have anticipated or prepared for. I asked him standard interview questions about his work history, his skills, his career goals, watching as he fumbled through answers while clearly being thrown off by the surreal nature of the situation. His resume claimed expertise in areas where I could tell he was bluffing, using buzzwords he had pedantly learned from internet job search advice articles. When I asked about his recent employment gap, nearly 2 years since the plant closure, he gave vague answers about challenging Dunhamet conditions and corporate restructuring. It was genuinely painful to watch him try to oversell himself to his own son, to put on a professional persona that didn't quite fit. The confident, dismissive man who had told me I would never amount to anything was gone, replaced by someone desperate and clearly diminished by years of disappointment. I found myself feeling something I hadn't expected, pity mixed with a strange sense of vindication. But I also felt something else that surprised me. For the first time in our entire relationship, I held all the power. The dynamic between us had completely reversed. As the interview wound down, I maintained my professional demeanor despite the emotional storm raging inside me. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Watt. We have several other candidates to interview, but we'll be in touch within the week with our decision." He stood to leave, adjusting his old briefcase and smoothing down his jacket, then hesitated at the door as if there was something else he needed to say. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 8 years of unspoken words. Finally, he turned back to me, his voice barely above a whisper, "Evan, I guess you really made it after all." There was something in his tone, not quite pride, not quite apology, but a kind of acknowledgement that felt significant after so many years of silence. I nodded slowly. "Yes, I did." After he left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at the space where he had been sitting, trying to process what had just happened. The boy inside me wanted to feel triumphant, but the man I had become felt something more complicated. Seeing him reduced to asking me for a job hadn't brought the satisfaction I had imagined. Instead, it raised new questions about what I owed him and what kind of person I wanted to be. 2 days later, as I was leaving the building after another long day, I found Dad waiting by my car in the parking garage. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older and more tired than he had during the interview. "We need to talk," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of desperation and determination. What followed was a conversation that was 15 years overdue, filled with all the words that had been building up between us since that night I left home. He started with excuses and justifications. "I was just tough on you because I wanted to make you strong. I was trying to prepare you for the real world, to make sure you wouldn't get your hopes up." But I was done accepting his version of events. "No," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You tried to break me. You told me I would fail because you had failed. You couldn't stand the idea that I might succeed where you hadn't." His face crumpled slightly, but he didn't deny it. "You were jealous of your own son," I continued, the words pouring out of me after years of being suppressed. "And you almost convinced me to give up on myself completely. Despite everything that had happened between us, despite the years of hurt and anger, I made him an offer that surprised us both. Not out of love or forgiveness, I wasn't ready for either of those yet, but because I needed to see what would happen next. There's an entry-level position open in our shipping and receiving department. I told him, watching his face carefully. It pays $15 an hour to start, with basic benefits after 90 days. The work is physical, loading trucks, managing inventory, that kind of thing. If you want it, it's yours. The look on his face was complex and difficult to read, gratitude mixed with humiliation, relief mixed with wounded pride. He was 58 years old, taking a job from his son that paid less than he had made at the manufacturing plant 20 years earlier. "I'll take it," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. I set clear expectations. He would be treated exactly like any other employee, he would report to a supervisor who wasn't me, our personal relationship would stay completely out of the workplace. As I watched him walk away toward his old pickup truck, I wondered if I was being generous or setting us both up for disaster. Dad's first week at Innovate Solutions was awkward for everyone involved, not just the two of us. Word spread quickly through the company grapevine that the new guy in shipping and quite know how to react. Some whispered about nepotism, wondering why someone as successful as I was would hire his dad for such a basic, low-level position. Others speculated about family drama, sensing that there was more to the story than they were seeing. Dad seemed acutely aware of the gossip and whispers, and it clearly bothered him more than he let on. He had gone from being completely independent, the head of his own household, to working for his son in front of hundreds of strangers who were watching every interaction with curiosity. During his lunch breaks, I sometimes saw him through my office window, eating alone at a corner table in the company cafeteria, looking smaller and more isolated than I remembered him ever being. He looked diminished by circumstances and age, worn down by years of rejection. Part of me felt genuinely bad for him, but I reminded myself that he had chosen this path when he chose pride and cruelty over support. Within a month of starting work, Dad began causing exactly the kind of Dunhamlums I had feared he might. He complained to coworkers about having to take orders from supervisors who were half his age, grumbling about kids these days, and how things used to be done better. He made pointed comments about how the company could be run more efficiently, despite having no understanding of our business model or industry. Worst of all, he started telling people a revised version of our family history, claiming that his son had only succeeded because he had taught him to be tough and prepared him for the real world. When these stories got back to me through the management chain, I felt that familiar old anger returning. He was trying to rewrite history, to claim credit for success that had come not because of his influence, but despite it. His supervisor, Tracy, came to me with growing concerns about his attitude and work performance. She told me diplomatically that while his work was adequate, his attitude was becoming disruptive. I told her to treat him exactly like any other employee, to document any issues, and to let me know if the Dunhamlums continued. Everything came to a dramatic head on a Thursday evening in November, almost 3 months after Dad had started working at the company. I was working late, trying to finish a presentation for the next day's board meeting, when I heard my office door open without a knock. I looked up to see Dad stumbling in, clearly drunk, his work shirt untucked and his hair disheveled. "This is all wrong," he slurred, gesturing wildly around my office with its expensive furniture and city views. "You think you're so much better than me now, sitting up here in your fancy office, but you stole this life. This success, this respect, this money, it should have been mine." The pain and resentment that had been building inside him for decades poured out in a torrent of words. He ranted about missed opportunities and bad luck, about a system that had been rigged against working-class people like him. As I listened to him ramble, trying to stay calm while he grew more agitated, I realized something important that changed my understanding of our entire relationship. His cruelty toward me hadn't been about making me stronger. It had been about making himself feel better about his own failures. He had tried to cut me down to his size because my potential reminded him of everything he had given up on. The next morning, still shaken by Dad's drunken breakdown in my office, I did something I had never done before. I drove to my childhood home and asked Mom if I could go through Dad's old things in the attic. What I found up there, covered in dust and forgotten for years, changed my understanding of everything that had happened between us. There were college acceptance letters from his youth, letters he had never pursued because of family pressure and financial concerns. There were business plans he had sketched out for inventions and services, dreams he had abandoned before even trying. There was a folder full of rejection letters from better jobs he had applied for over the years but never gotten, dreams that had been crushed by economic reality and his own fears. I saw a clear pattern emerging, evidence of someone who had once had dreams and ambitions but had let fear and doubt defeat him at every turn. My success wasn't just a reminder of his failures, it was living proof that he could have succeeded too, if he had been brave enough to take risks and persist through setbacks the way I had. For the first time in my life, I understood that his cruelty toward me had been born not from strength, but from his own broken dreams and crushed spirit. Armed with this new understanding, I confronted Dad the next day, calling him into my office during what I knew would be his lunch break. "You weren't protecting me from failure or disappointment," I told him, laying out some of the documents I had found in the attic. "You were jealous that I had the courage you never had. You were afraid that I would succeed where you had been too scared to even try." His face went through a series of emotions as he looked at his old acceptance letters and business plans: anger, denial, recognition, and finally something that might have been shame. "Maybe that's true," he said quietly, his voice barely audible in the large office. "Maybe I was scared. Maybe I did see you going after the same kinds of dreams I had given up on." But then his jaw hardened, and I saw the familiar stubborn pride that had defined him. "But I'm not going to apologize for the way I raised you, Evan. Look how you turned out. Look at all this success. Maybe my tough love is exactly what made you strong enough to achieve all this." That's when I realized that despite everything, the job loss, the desperation, the role reversal, nothing fundamental had really changed about who he was. He still couldn't take full responsibility for the emotional damage he had caused. The final decision came to me with startling clarity, like sunrise after a long, confusing night. I called Dad into my office the following Monday morning, and this time I had Tracy from HR present as a witness. "This isn't working out," I told him, my voice steady and professional. "I'm letting you go, effective immediately." He started to protest, to argue that I was being unfair, but I cut him off before he could build momentum. "You were wrong about me, Dad. You said I would never afford college, never succeed, never amount to anything more than you had achieved. But here we are. You're sitting in my office, in my company, having worked for me for 3 months because you needed the job I gave you." His face flushed red with anger and embarrassment, but I continued calmly. "I've proven that everything you said about my limitations was false. But more than that, I won't let you drag me down to your level of bitterness. I won't let you poison this workplace with your negativity and your inability to take responsibility for your own choices." I slid a final paycheck across the desk to him. "You had your chance to be part of my success story, and you chose pride over humility and growth." As security escorted Dad from the building per company policy, I watched from my office window as he walked across the parking lot toward his truck for the last time. I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years, genuine peace. The voice in my head that had always whispered his criticisms and limitations, the voice that had pushed me forward through sheer spite and determination, finally went completely quiet. I had proven everything I needed to prove, not just to him, but to myself and to the scared 16-year-old boy who still lived somewhere inside me. That evening, I walked out of the office building and into the cool autumn air, the city lights sparkling around me like possibilities made visible. Each light represented dreams and achievements, the kind of future that boy at the kitchen table had been told was impossible. I thought about him, about me, and realized that scared kid would be incredibly proud of the man I had become. My revenge hadn't been cruelty or public humiliation. It had been success, achievement, and the quiet satisfaction of proving every limitation wrong. My victory hadn't been his downfall, it had been my rise above the circumstances he had tried to trap me in. As I drove home through the city I had conquered, I smiled. Sometimes the best revenge really is simply proving them wrong. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now.